Morgan Alexander stood silently by the airport terminal window, her eyes fixed on the plane she had just been kicked off. Just minutes earlier, a flight attendant had loudly humiliated her in front of dozens of passengers, a casually dressed black woman, looked down on just because of her appearance. But now, that same flight attendant was panicking, waving for Morgan to come back, because just seconds later, Morgan's voice echoed throughout the airport over the PA system. "This is your CEO speaking. Flight 2187 is officially grounded." The whole airport froze in shock. What just happened? An ordinary passenger, no, a CEO had been humiliated, dragged off a flight she owned. But this time, she wasn't going to stay silent. Before we dive into the story of discrimination, justice, and a decision that shook the airline industry, let us know where you're watching from and hit subscribe so you don't miss any journeys like this. She entered the airport terminal like any other passenger. Dark blue jeans, a beige crew neck shirt, neatly tied up hair, no makeup, no designer bag, no polished leather shoes. No one could guess who the woman dragging that silver-gray suitcase with no logo was. And maybe that's why people dared to look down on her. Her name is Morgan Alexander, 36 years old. She used to live in the poor working-class neighborhood in South Atlanta. Her mother was a laundry worker. Her father passed away when she was 8. She worked part-time at a bakery and cleaned stadium bathrooms just to save money for college. 10 years later, she became the founder and CEO of a top software company in passenger data analytics, a company that bought 17% of the shares in one of the country's biggest airlines, Airbright. But that afternoon, at departure gate D34, no one saw any of that. They just saw a casually dressed black woman. Morgan arrived early. She always arrived early, a habit from the days she worked double shifts with only a few minutes for lunch. She stood in the boarding area, holding a business class ticket. Seat 2B, flight from Denver to Chicago. "Hello." A ticket agent smiled faintly, glancing down at the ticket, then looking Morgan up and down. That hesitant look lasted only a few seconds, but was enough for Morgan to know once again. They didn't think she belonged in the priority line. When boarding began, she moved toward the gate. Right then, a tall flight attendant with blonde hair named Travis stepped out from the jet bridge, blocking her path and said, "Sorry, the priority boarding area is only for business class passengers." Morgan replied softly, "I'm in business class. Here's my ticket." She held out her boarding pass. Travis took it, squinted, then looked it over as if checking for a fake passenger. "You might have the wrong flight," he said, trying to stay polite, but clearly suspicious. Morgan stayed calm, though she could feel the eyes of the people behind her watching. Some frowned, some sighed in frustration at someone out of place blocking the way. A few minutes later, after she confirmed again with both her ticket and ID, Travis whispered with another flight attendant, Shannon. They whispered something. Then Shannon turned to Morgan with a face as cold as ice and said, "We have the right to refuse passengers who don't fit. Please return to the economy class line." The whole terminal seemed to hold its breath, but Morgan didn't resist. She only asked one question. "Why do you think I don't belong?" Shannon looked her straight in the eye. "Because no one buys a business class ticket and shows up like this." Like this. A black woman in jeans and a button-down shirt. All the old wounds inside Morgan rose up like a wave. She remembered being a student, attending her first scholarship seminar, stopped by security for not looking like a guest. She remembered her first meeting with an investor, being asked by the secretary to sit in the delivery staff waiting area. But this time, things were different. Morgan didn't say another word. She quietly stepped out of the line, walked into the airport waiting room, opened her laptop, connected to Airbright's internal management system, and confirmed the emergency authority under Clause 14.7b of the shareholder agreement temporarily suspending the flight operation in case of signs of systemic discrimination violations. A message was sent to the CEO of Airbright, the HR director, the flight operations director, and the airport supervisor. The content read, Activating Clause 14.7b, Suspending Flight 2187. Reason discrimination with eyewitness evidence. She stood up. She returned to the boarding area. Just minutes later, the familiar voice rang out over the airport's internal speaker. This is Morgan Alexander, senior executive and strategic shareholder. I am ordering the immediate suspension of Flight 2187 to serve an internal investigation. The entire boarding area fell silent. The woman they thought didn't deserve a business class seat just made it clear who she really was. As Morgan's announcement echoed, the entire gate, D34 area was plunged into a suffocating silence. Passengers who hadn't boarded yet stood frozen in shock. Those who were already seated in the cabin suddenly stood up all at once, pulling out their phones. Confused eyes all turned toward the flight crew. A mother holding her young child whispered, "What's going on?" Meanwhile, in business class, an older couple sitting in seats 2A-2B slowly took off their headphones and looked at each other as if they couldn't understand why the flight they were on suddenly got suspended. Travis, who earlier had fiercely stopped Morgan from boarding, now looked pale. He stammered quietly into the radio. I thought she was just a regular passenger." A ground staff member rushed in, out of breath, loudly saying, "Stop all door closing procedures. There's an emergency order from above." On the plane, Shannon suddenly fell silent. She gripped the iPad, displaying the passenger list tightly. But Morgan Alexander's name, seat 2B, was still clearly there. She couldn't erase it, couldn't change it, couldn't make any excuses. And that made her face flush not with anger, but with shame. Another flight attendant, Daniel, whispered, "Travis, you said she wasn't on the list. Are you sure?" Travis weakly nodded. I didn't check carefully. I just thought she was dressed too plainly." "So, oh my God," Daniel sighed deeply. The atmosphere on the plane grew heavy and tense. Everyone sensed that something serious was happening. It wasn't a technical issue. It was a human issue. At that moment, Morgan walked slowly through the boarding door. No one invited her. No explanations given. Her gaze was cold, no longer gentle like before. Her sneakers clicked sharply on the steel floor, sounding like a warning. She walked straight into the business class cabin. A passenger stood up to let her pass. Someone whispered, "That's her, the one who gave the suspension order." Morgan didn't look at anyone. She went straight to seat 2B, her own seat, where a strange female passenger was currently sitting. The woman looked up. "Sorry, I thought this was my seat." Morgan politely replied, "This is my ticket. And this flight is partly mine as well." There was no arrogance in her words, only truth. The woman froze, then quietly stood up. Morgan sat down and fastened her seatbelt. No one dared say a word. Travis and Shannon followed behind her. They didn't know whether to apologize, stay silent, or just leave the cabin right then. They froze in the middle of the cabin, surrounded by dozens of staring eyes. Some eyes were angry, some were accusing. But mostly, there were cautious looks. We saw everything. Just then, a passenger in seat 3B, a middle-aged man in a suit, but no tie, stood up and raised his phone directly at Travis and Shannon. He spoke loudly, without hiding anything at first. "I thought you two were just making things difficult for her by mistake. But now I see this is prejudice, and I'm recording everything to send to the company's executives." The sound of the plane fell silent. All sounds seemed to be sucked into a void. Travis stammered. I was just going with my gut. Shannon blushed. No one ever told me how to tell if someone's a business-class passenger or not. The man sneered. Then today's your real lesson. In economy class, whispers spread. Is that woman the CEO? I heard she's a major shareholder in this airline. What on earth is going on? In the cockpit, Captain Richards just received a call from the Flight Operations Center. The voice on the other end was clear and firm. Do not take off. Flight suspended per internal order. Passenger Morgan Alexander has triggered the emergency shareholder clause. Wait to verify the entire crew. The captain stood silently. He turned to the first officer. I've been flying for 22 years and never been stopped because... The CEO is on board, the first officer whispered. Are we in trouble? The captain shook his head. No, not if we stay out of it. Down in the cabin, a child sitting in seat 15A quietly asked his mother, Mom, who is that lady that made the plane stop? The mother squeezed her son's hand, whispering, She's the kind of person everyone ends up having to listen to. When Airbright Flight 2187 came to a halt, everything inside the cabin seemed frozen in time. No one moved. No one dared to speak. Eyes met briefly before quickly looking away. The man wearing headphones took them off. The young woman typing on her laptop suddenly stopped. Her fingers froze mid-air, as if any movement would be disrespectful. Travis and Shannon pressed themselves against the cabin wall, keeping their distance from Morgan, as if afraid her gaze could reveal every hidden truth. But Morgan didn't look at them. She sat still, eyes half closed, as if weighing her next move carefully. In the economy section, a white boy of about 8 turned to his mother and whispered, Why are people looking at her like that? The mother pressed her lips together, about to say something, then stopped. Her eyes glanced towards the business class cabin with a mix of shame and caution. She'd never thought of herself as someone who judged others. But now, seeing someone humiliated just because of how she looks, she couldn't deny it was happening, and that she had stayed silent before. At that moment, a young woman in the airline's intern uniform stepped up from the back cabin. Her name was Lila, only 19 years old, a sophomore studying aviation, who had just started her internship last month. She walked down the aisle, noticing the heavy silence and thick tension in the air. When her eyes met Morgan's, her heart skipped a beat. Lila had witnessed the whole situation from afar, from the rear cabin when Morgan was asked to leave the plane. She couldn't believe her eyes. When Morgan came back and declared the flight suspended, she just held her breath. Now, seeing that woman still sitting there, steady and calm, Lila felt a pang in her chest, both admiration and shame. She thought of her mother, who had once been denied a flight coordinator position simply for lacking a professional image. She remembered the first time she boarded a commercial flight and was mistakenly shown to the last row, even though her ticket was for first class. Lila walked slowly toward Morgan and quietly placed a bottle of water on her tray table. Then she bent down, voice soft but clear. Thank you. Morgan opened her eyes, looking at the girl with a hint of surprise. For what? For not staying silent like everyone else. Morgan said nothing, but her eyes softened. Maybe, in this tense and fake atmosphere, that thank you was the only genuine thing. At that moment, a man sitting in seat 4C pulled out his phone and typed a message. CEO suspends flight right in the middle of boarding. Something big is happening. Sending video. The message was sent along with a clip showing Morgan boarding the plane. Just 45 seconds later, the video appeared on the internal social network. From there, like a whirlwind, the news spread to Twitter, TikTok, and aviation Facebook groups. The hashtag CEO flight freeze started trending. The first comments read, "Is this for real?" The CEO in seat 2B got kicked off his own plane. Unbelievable. But if it's true, this is definitely textbook material. A slap right across how this company trains its staff. Phones started buzzing in the cabin. Passengers leaned forward to catch the new announcements. Some began secretly recording videos. Travis, still at his post, muttered under his breath, "I'm done for." Shannon gasped, turning to Daniel and whispering, "You said they didn't check." Daniel was speechless. He knew things had gotten out of control. And he knew he'd overlooked it, didn't step in, and now there was no chance to fix it with words. From the cockpit, Captain Richard stepped out. He walked straight to business class and stopped in front of Morgan. "I'm the captain of this flight. I have received a suspension order. Please confirm. Are you Morgan Alexander?" Morgan answered without hesitation. "Yes, that's me. 17% shareholder. Temporary suspension rights under Clause 14.7b. The captain nodded. His eyes darkened. He spoke slowly. "I apologize for what happened. If any action from the flight crew was offensive, we will take responsibility." Morgan looked him straight in the eye and replied softly, "Good. Then let's start with the truth." She pointed toward Travis and Shannon. "Those two, they said I wasn't qualified to sit in the seat I bought. They refused to check my name. And they publicly humiliated me." The entire cabin fell completely silent. Then, from the back, a quiet voice spoke up. "Lila, I witnessed it. I was standing behind. I heard everything clearly. She's telling the truth. They never scanned her boarding pass, just looked at her and judged." Lila stood there, hands shaking but eyes steady. She had chosen a side. Morgan looked at her, this time not just gently but with pride. The cockpit door was ajar. But inside, the atmosphere was no longer what it had been. Captain Richard sat quietly in the main pilot's seat, fingers interlaced, eyes looking ahead but no longer seeing any runway. He had just stepped out of the cockpit to verify information and returned with a truth bigger than any flight. The passenger the crew had just insulted was a strategic shareholder, the CEO whom internal reports mentioned with cautious respect. And now, she was sitting in the business class seat, the very spot they had said she didn't deserve. First Officer Manuel, almost 15 years younger than Richards, turned with a stunned expression. "What do you think the airline will do about this?" Richards didn't answer right away. He sighed, looking down at the control panel, as if clinging to some technical detail to escape the current mess. "It's not the airline's call," he said quietly but firmly. "It's hers. In the crew area." Travis began to panic. He backed into a corner near the galley, fingers tapping frantically on his phone. But no one answered. As for Shannon, though she tried to stay calm, her hands trembled as she held the internal iPad. Every time Morgan Alexander's name popped up on the priority passenger list, she blinked, as if trying to deny it. But reality doesn't disappear just because you refuse to see it. It's just waiting for the right moment to strike like a hammer. Daniel, the most experienced flight attendant among the three, tried to mediate. He stepped closer to Morgan, standing just far enough to avoid invading her space, and said, "Ms. Alexander, I sincerely apologize. I didn't intervene directly when this happened, and that was my fault. But if you allow me, I'd like to review the records to assist with handling this." Morgan looked up at him. Still with that same look, no anger, no emotion, but it was that very calmness that made the other person uneasy. "You didn't intervene, which means you chose to stand with silence," she said slowly. And silence is always the most dangerous kind of complicity. Daniel bowed his head. He knows she's right. Meanwhile, in economy class, many passengers have started to speak up. Some are recording videos, others are making phone calls. A middle-aged passenger in a suit, sitting in seat 17C, loudly says into his phone, "I can't believe this." And there's more. Rachel replies. We've identified 3 other cases in the past 6 months. All were passengers of color in business class. All were reassigned seats after the exact same action from the same account, Travis's. Morgan grips the armrest lightly. Send me the full report and start a system-wide investigation with this filter. Any passenger moved within 10 minutes of boarding sorted by race, gender, or region already started. And it seems this isn't just an individual mistake. At the same time, the passenger in seat 5C, a lawyer named Jonathan, is typing an email to the New York Times. Subject: high-profile victim. CEO of color booted from business class. I witnessed it all. Near the airplane door, 3 new flight attendants walk in. Dressed neatly, name tags clearly visible. They nodded to the captain, then, one by one, entered the cockpit. The whole plane seemed to hold its breath. They were the final confirmation that the old crew had officially ended their shift. Travis saw his replacement, a middle-aged Asian man with a calm demeanor, and couldn't help but whisper to Shannon, "Are they really any better than me?" Shannon, for the first time since the flight started, turned to look him straight in the eye. At least they know how to respect the passengers. Morgan didn't stand up. She didn't have to, but her eyes followed every step the new crew took, as if reaffirming the belief that the flight was now back on the right track. Captain Richard stepped forward, stood before the entire cabin, and said briefly, "The crew has been replaced. I pledge in my capacity as captain and in the honor of aviation, every passenger will be treated fairly and with dignity." Morgan said nothing, but the passengers did. A young man raised his hand and asked loudly, "What about the old crew? What's going to happen to them?" Before the captain could answer, Morgan gently replied, "They will be investigated, and if found guilty, they won't be flying with Airbright again." A round of applause broke out, not too loud, but steady. And this time, not because of a dramatic twist, but because of a sense of justice, something people thought was lost up in the air. The crew quickly settled into their positions. Meanwhile, Travis, Shannon, and Daniel stood close by the aisle near the plane door, nervously watching every move of the people replacing them. Every passenger knew they were about to be taken off the plane, but no one showed any regret. The new lead flight attendant, named Amelia, approached the business class cabin, gave a slight bow to Morgan, and said, "Ms. Alexander, I'm sorry for what you've been through. We will serve according to the standards of an ethical airline." Morgan nodded lightly, showing no intention of making things difficult. But from her gaze, it was clear empty apologies were no longer enough. As passengers began settling their luggage, Rachel called to update Morgan. "We checked the 3 cases where seat changes happened that I told you about. All 3 had something in common: passengers of color, dressed simply, traveling alone. And in all 3 cases, Travis was the one who confirmed the seat reassignments." Morgan closed her eyes for a moment. Her voice remained calm but colder, and none of them received any reasonable explanation. Correct. They were only told it was due to operational needs, but in reality, those seats were then given to other passengers, all white, all platinum members. "So there's a pattern," Morgan said, "and that pattern is called bias." In economy class, a group of passengers began talking among themselves. An older man said, I've been flying for 30 years. I've never seen anyone get bumped down to economy from business class that fast. Unless they look like they have money. A black woman sitting in row 22 added, I was once asked to move to the back, even though my ticket clearly said Seat A1. The reason given was system error. But looking back, that system only seemed to fail people like me. The murmurs were no longer scattered. It became a quiet conversation spreading throughout the cabin. No shouting, no yelling, but it peeled back the shiny surface called standard procedure that the airline industry uses to hide prejudice at the back of the plane. Lila received another message from HR Lila. Thank you for keeping the original evidence. Your recording is crucial. The board is recommending inviting you to join the internal training advisory group. Her eyes widened. She could hardly believe it. A day that started like any other internship, and now she was about to become a witness, bringing part of the truth to light. Morgan glanced at her watch. 6:46 p.m. The flight was nearly an hour and a half late. But no one complained. She stood up, left her seat, and headed toward the plane's door where the 3 old crew members were still standing. Her voice was just loud enough to hear, but every word was clear. Daniel, Shannon, and Travis. You're not being replaced because I'm the CEO. You're being replaced because you chose to treat people based on who they are, not the rules. And now, the rules will handle you. Daniel was about to speak, but Morgan raised her hand. No need to say anything more. The lawyers will be in touch. Then she turned to the nearby passengers, her tone calm. I apologize for the disruption to the flight. But I won't apologize for taking action. A passenger stood up. You don't have to. You did the right thing. Right after, the airport supervision team came on board. A tall female officer, her badge clearly reading Senior Personnel Supervisor, asked the old crew to hand over their internal badges and leave the plane. Shannon quietly complied. Daniel said nothing. Travis, usually confident and a bit arrogant, bit his lip, hesitated for a second, then took off his badge too. As they walked out of the cabin, there were no curses, no jeers. Only silence, the heaviest sound of judgment. Morgan returned to her seat. She sat down. But instead of opening her laptop, she replayed the video a passenger had taken of Travis tearing up her ticket. Every rewind made each detail clearer. She didn't want to remember, but she needed to, so no one else would have to feel that way again. Rachel called again. The board has approved the decision. Starting next month, Airbright will roll out the No Bias, No Exclusion training program for all employees. Morgan asked, what about the 3 passengers who were removed earlier? They've been contacted, apologies made, refunds issued, and permanent membership granted. Good, she nodded. Now it's time to make things right. Not out of fear of reputation loss, but because it's time for real change. The plane still hadn't taken off. But the atmosphere had shifted, no longer stifling, no more fear. Everyone seemed to be waiting not just for a flight, but for a new chapter. 20 minutes after the old crew left the plane, the group of passengers began settling into their seats. Whispers were still there, but they had turned into conversations. Not about what just happened, but about how one quiet but powerful woman had overturned a system with nothing but the truth. At the front of the plane, Morgan was reviewing an internal report Rachel had just sent. The document detailed 3 similar incidents involving her in Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Houston. They all had one thing in common: passengers of color, traveling alone, seated in business class, were moved with the reason operational rearrangement. What stood out all 3 times, the internal account making the changes, was Travis, crew Airbright, global. Morgan sent a message to Rachel. I want to review every access log from this account over the last 12 months, including access times, edited data entries, and locations of changes. Rachel responded almost immediately. Request sent to legal and IT teams. Along with that, I found this. Travis edited the data at least 5 times without recording any reason. Morgan frowned. She knew the Airbright system well, the CRM platform and operations monitoring that had cost millions to build. Every change had to have a verification note. So how could a flight attendant manipulate the system so blatantly? Before she could ask, Rachel called back. "You need to hear this in person," Rachel said. "I just checked the internal complaint records that have been on hold for the past 18 months. Among them, there are 3 accusations involving Travis, but all 3 were marked insufficient evidence. The approving signature is Samuel J. Green, the head of the Crew Behavior Oversight Department." Morgan was silent for a few seconds. That name wasn't unfamiliar. Samuel was the one who strongly opposed when Morgan proposed quarterly ethics audits for employees. At that time, he claimed it was too costly and disruptive to operations. Morgan asked, "Does he still have system access?" "Not locked yet, but I'm requesting an immediate temporary suspension of all personnel intervention rights from his oversight department. Do it now, and send the official notice to the entire board." Meanwhile, Lila, the intern who just went through the cabin storm, received a call from the central training office. "Lila, congratulations. You've been nominated to participate in the internal training course on professional ethics and anti-bias launched by the executive board. You will be the frontline representative for the new generation of flight attendants." Lila was speechless. She never thought that her shaky voice on her first flight duty would make an airline corporation take a hard look at itself. In the middle cabin, passengers continued sharing. Emma, the first to record the video of Morgan being insulted, handed her phone to Morgan and said, "I saved the original. If you need it, I'm ready to testify." Morgan smiled softly. "You already did." "Thank you." Michael, who filmed from a different angle, added, "We're not doing this because you're the CEO, but because you don't deserve to be treated that way. And no one deserves that." Morgan nodded. Rachel messaged again. "Breaking news, Samuel Green just submitted a 30-day leave request with no reason, only 10 minutes after I sent the suspension notice." Morgan just smirked. That move was nothing short of an admission. No apology, no explanation, just backing down as the support network starts to crack. In the cockpit area, Captain Richards whispered to his assistant for the first time in 20 years of flying, "I've seen a CEO not sitting in a meeting room but handling the problem right on the plane," the assistant replied. "And for the first time, I believe the internal culture will change, not just through emails," while the cabin was quiet, waiting for takeoff procedures. Morgan replayed a recording on her phone. It was Lila's voice, shaky but clear. "I saw Ms. Morgan's boarding pass light up green. I witnessed it being torn up. I have a recording of them mocking her cheap outfit." Morgan went silent, not out of anger, but moved. Because of that courage, from someone with no power, no position, just a conscience. She typed one last line to Rachel. "We're not just punishing behavior. We're ending a culture of cover-ups," Rachel replied. And it all started with a torn ticket in business class. The engines began to hum softly, signaling the flight was about to take off. But in the cabin, no one thought about arrival time, luggage, or meals. All eyes were still on the woman in the black jacket in seat 2B, the one who just hours before had her ticket torn up, was asked to leave the plane. And now, was the person behind the decision to change the fate of those who just left here? Morgan picked up the handheld mic and asked permission to speak to all passengers. No one objected. On the contrary, a few nodded softly, as if they had been waiting for this. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and calm. "I'm Morgan Alexander, CEO and major shareholder of Airbright Airlines. I apologize for the delay on this flight. But I'm not sorry for requesting a crew replacement." A wave of silence swept through the cabin. She continued, "I used to think that as long as we built a solid system and set clear rules, the service culture would naturally follow. But today, I realize rules alone can't save character, and no process is good enough if the person enforcing it looks at people with bias." Mia, the young flight attendant sitting nearby, slightly bowed her head. Emma, Michael, and many other passengers were silent, but their eyes glistened. This wasn't a PR speech. It was a confession honest and brave from the very founder of the airline. Morgan paused for a few seconds, then looked around the cabin. "You've just witnessed something that shouldn't have happened, but has happened many times. And this time, we won't let it slide as a minor mistake. Starting next month, Airbright will implement 3 major changes." She held up 3 fingers. "First, every passenger who is reassigned a seat or delayed without clear reason will receive a copy of the decision signed by the person in charge. Second, the internal interface will log every action, and anyone who deletes a passenger's name from the seating chart must have approval from senior management. Third, the crew behavior monitoring team will be completely restructured, and I will personally approve the staffing for this department." The passengers began to nod. A few quietly clapped, not just polite clapping, but genuine applause for the change they were witnessing firsthand. Morgan set the microphone down. She didn't smile. She just quietly stared out the window where the runway stretched like a dividing line between old and new. Captain Richards announced from the cockpit, "We're waiting for the takeoff light. Please keep your seatbelts fastened." And if I may say something personal, after flying planes for 22 years, I used to think my job was just to get passengers safely from point A to point B, but today, I've learned something more. Safety also means feeling respected when you step on board. This time, the applause was louder. Some passengers in the back even sat up in their seats and whispered to each other. Those words mean more than any business class meal. Absolutely. It's the first time I've really felt like the airline is actually listening to me. Lila, the young woman who had only dared to stay tucked away in the galley, was now standing in the aisle, her eyes full of determination. She was no longer a shy trainee, but someone beginning to believe her voice mattered even if it was small. Morgan turned to her and quietly said, "Today, you taught me a lesson. Thank you." Lila blushed and looked down. But everyone could see the light in her eyes. In another row, an elderly couple called Morgan over as she walked by. The woman took her hand and said, "We used to think things like this would never change, but today, hope seems to have taken flight with this journey." Morgan nodded, squeezing her hand gently, "And it won't be landing back where it started." She returned to her seat and buckled her seatbelt for the first time during the flight, not because of rules, but because she knew she was about to begin a longer journey, not just in the sky, but within the heart of an organization that needs to wake up. The sound of the plane's wheels grinding down the runway rang out sharply. The signal light turned green. Pilot Richards gently lifted the nose of the plane into the air. Flight 2187, after everything that had happened, finally took off. But in the hearts of the 134 passengers on board, it felt like more than just flying. It was leaving behind a twisted past and moving toward something right. In business class, Morgan closed her eyes for a few seconds, not because she was tired, but to hold on to that precious moment of silence. She no longer had to push herself to prove she deserved her place. No need to assert her status through a title anymore. She was just a passenger, but this time, she was truly respected as one. Mia came over carefully and poured her a glass of water. "Is there anything else you need?" Mia asked, this time not by the training script, but with genuine sincerity from the heart. Morgan looked at the young woman for a moment, then smiled softly. "Thank you." "You're doing really well." Mia was surprised. Her eyes were slightly wet, but she didn't let the tears fall. Behind her, Lila was handing out water to the economy class cabin crew. When she reached Michael and Emma, they both stood up to let her pass. Emma whispered, "Stay strong. Lila, you did something many adults wouldn't dare to do." Lila blushed and nodded slightly. This was no longer just an internship. This was a graduation of conscience. Morgan opened his laptop and checked the summary report Rachel had sent. In the past 2 hours, Airbright's internal media channel received over 4,000 responses from employees supporting the temporary suspension of the behavior monitoring department. More than 300 customer emails thanked the company for finally taking action, not just apologizing. A message from James, a board member. "Morgan, you just saved the whole airline from a crisis without any PR campaign." Morgan typed back 3 words. Not worthy of praise. She knew that without the stares, protests, recordings, and videos. She, the CEO of the airline, might have left that airplane cabin like a suspected, insulted person, then quietly erased from the system as if she never existed. She took a deep breath and then wrote, "We owe it to our passengers. We owe it to Lila. To an entire generation boldly demanding justice." Flight attendant Amelia came over and handed Morgan a printout. "Ms. Alexander, here's the list of the new flight crew members. All have signed the ethics pledge before taking on this flight." Morgan took it and read each line, not to check, but to remember the first people laying the foundation for a new culture. The pilot's voice came over the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are currently flying at 36,000 feet, with an outside temperature of 45 degrees Celsius. The crew sincerely thanks you for joining us on this unusual but meaningful journey. A special thank you to Ms. Morgan Alexander for choosing to fly with Airbright today." A wave of applause broke out, this time genuine. It rolled from business class down to economy. Many passengers stood up, turning to look toward row 2. Morgan stood, nodded, then sat back down. She didn't need to give a speech. Her actions said it all. Meanwhile, Emma uploaded the 3rd video online. Captioned, "Not a celebrity. Not an artist. Just a woman in a black coat, ticket torn, who changed an entire flight. Airbright reset. CEO in seat 2B. Michael shared a clip of Morgan's statement. "Rules don't save character. Today, we're starting fresh." Both clips hit over 1 million views within 15 minutes. At the back of the cabin, a young mother whispered to her daughter, "Do you see the lady in row 2? She used to be kicked off because people thought she wasn't classy enough, but now, she's the one changing everything." The little girl asked in confusion, "Is she a princess?" "Mom," her mother smiled and said, "Even more than that. Honey. She's the one in charge of this whole plane, not with a crown, but with courage." As the flight stabilized at cruising altitude, Airbright's entire network system started buzzing behind the scenes. On the laptop screen in front of Morgan, the dashboard showed numbers that would make any director hold their breath. Nearly 7,000 internal review requests sent from branches across the U.S., all within just 2 hours. Not just because of the scandal, but because finally, someone dared to touch the untouchable, the flight crew behavior monitoring department, long seen as immune to inspection. Rachel called in via live video from headquarters. "The press is flooding in, but I arranged for CNN to replay your speech on the plane. No edits? No cuts? Morgan nodded. No need for a meeting room. No PR spin. We'll show the world the raw truth, Rachel added. I've sent a request for all branches to keep their data logs intact for 24 months for the investigation. Good job, Morgan replied. Stay in touch with the Department of Justice if needed. In economy class. A group of students from Atlanta traveling together just finished watching the video online. One girl in the group looked toward row 2 and whispered, "She didn't just keep her ticket, she also held on to our dignity." The guy next to her quietly said, "First time in my life I've seen someone win when treated unfairly." Without yelling, the captain's announcement came over the speakers. We will begin our descent to land at LAX International Airport in 32 minutes. On behalf of the crew, thank you for flying with us today. A flight unlike any other. Meanwhile, Linda, the female security officer who once used the radio to order Morgan's removal, stood in a corner near the restroom, deep in thought. She wasn't kicked out. She wasn't criticized. But inside her was a heavy storm that no one could see. Morgan stood up and walked over to Linda. She didn't need to say much. Just gently, "I know you were caught between orders and feelings." Linda looked up, silent. "You hesitated then," Morgan said. "That was a small bright spot. Enough for me not to see you as someone blindly following wrongdoing." Linda choked up. After a moment, she finally spoke. "I almost crossed the line. Just one more step and I would have become a real accomplice." Morgan nodded. "But you didn't take it. And that's why you're still here." From a distance, Mia approached, holding up a new shiny nameplate with a badge that read, "Internal Ethics Representative." Linda looked at the badge, then at Mia, the young woman she had once ignored. Mia softly said, "If you want, we can start over." Linda glanced at Morgan. Morgan said simply, "We don't need perfection, we need awareness." The whole cabin suddenly felt unusually warm. The atmosphere wasn't tense like at takeoff, but like a community that had just weathered a storm and stood strong. A little girl about 8 years old, sitting in row 18, asked her mother, "Mom, why is everyone clapping before the plane has even landed?" Her mother smiled, "Because they feel respected, sweetheart, and because someone stood up when it would have been easier to just stay seated." Meanwhile, Morgan, returning to her seat, found a small envelope placed on the tray table. Inside was a neatly folded note, handwritten by some anonymous passenger. "You didn't just take back your seat. You reclaimed our place in this world. We will be landing at Los Angeles International Airport in 5 minutes. Outside temperature is 72 degrees Fahrenheit. Clear skies." Captain Richards's steady voice echoed throughout the cabin. But for the hundreds on board, the weather was no longer the most important thing. Morgan stood up, still holding tightly to the small crew microphone. This time, not to justify or react, but to make a statement. A statement that would not only end a flight, but also mark the start of a whole new direction. She stepped forward, her eyes scanning each row. "Before we land," Morgan spoke slowly, "I want to say a final word as a fellow traveler and as the leader responsible for everything that's happened." The cabin fell completely silent. Even first-time flyers felt the weight behind every word. Today, I was insulted. Removed from a position I held, had my ticket ripped up right in first class, not because of a technical issue, not for security reasons, but for something very old prejudice. Mia stood at the cabin door, gripping the emergency microphone, but her eyes never left Morgan. Morgan continued, "I am the CEO of this airline, but what matters isn't the title. It's this: if this happened to me, it has happened and will happen to thousands of others. People with no cameras, no film crews, no power except their own self-respect." A voice from row 7 called out, That's right. Then another voice from row 11. Then scattered applause, but Morgan raised her hand, signaling for silence. She wasn't finished. Starting tomorrow, she said, Airbright Airlines will implement 4 core changes system-wide, overseen directly by the board of directors and an independent review committee. All flight attendants, security staff, and pilots will undergo mandatory retraining on unconscious bias response. Regardless of rank, no exceptions. Each branch will have at least 2 ethics representatives independently chosen by frontline employees, not appointed by management. All ticket changes, seat reassignments, or passenger removals must be logged in an open system that allows real-time retrospective audits by internal compliance. And finally, every passenger who experienced a similar incident in the past 5 years will be invited to provide feedback and will receive a refund along with a formal apology letter if the case is confirmed. The entire business class cabin fell silent. Some closed their eyes. Some covered their mouths with their hands. Others pulled out their phones not to film, but to take notes on a commitment never before seen in domestic aviation history. Morgan lowered the microphone, but didn't leave yet. She turned around, facing the back of the cabin where Linda stood beside Mia. And to these 2 women, Morgan said clearly, I want to make a personal statement. Linda, I don't blame you for doing your job right, but I believe you will become the best security trainer if you let your heart lead before orders. Linda was on the verge of tears, trying to stay calm. You will be retrained. Then, you'll be in charge of ethics checks for other flight crews. She turned to Mia. And you. Mia, not just a flight attendant. You will be the leader of Airbright's first ethical response team. As a living witness and someone brave enough to speak up when the whole cabin is silent, the entire cabin erupted into a thunderous round of applause, not for the title, but for justice. This time, no one said, "The CEO's so cool," or "She only won because she's rich." This time, they applauded someone who stood up and pulled the whole system to its feet with her. The announcement echoed from the cockpit. We are preparing to land. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. Morgan sat down in her seat. To be, but no one doubted anymore that it was her spot. No more judging looks. No more whispers behind her back. Linda walked by, stopped beside her, and said seriously, "Thank you for not firing me," Morgan replied. "Thank you for not giving up too soon." The plane touched down on the runway, shaking gently. But inside each person, it was a landing steadier than any before. The airplane door opened. The first chill of the Los Angeles night swept into the cabin like a cleansing breeze. Passengers stepped out of cabin 2187, not in their usual rush, but with slow, deliberate steps, as if they had just gone through a transformation ceremony. Morgan Alexander waited at the door, without any leadership formalities, just simply as a person who chose not to run away. Each passenger walked past her. No one asked, "Who are you?" anymore. They knew, and more importantly, they felt they understood themselves better after witnessing the story. They knew, and more importantly, they felt they understood themselves better after witnessing the story. An older woman took Morgan's hand. "You just showed me it's never too late to teach a system again." A teenager in a hoodie bowed deeply and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up." On behalf of all of us, Emma Larson stepped forward. Her phone still open to Twitter. Her post had just hit 4 million views. "Do you want me to take it down?" Emma asked sincerely. Morgan shook her head. "No, don't let it just be a trend. Let it be proof." Mia stood beside her, now wearing the uniform jacket with the badge, Airway Ethics Representative. She was no longer an intern. You're the symbol of doing what's right when it seems like everyone else is staying silent. Linda stood beside her, eyes red, but her gaze was steadier than ever. They both looked at Morgan. Morgan just said, "You two will come with me to headquarters." Starting tomorrow morning, we begin a new phase, not writing reports, but rewriting the culture. Rachel kept calling through the earpiece, the New York Times, NPR, even the BBC want interviews, but I've turned them all down. Why? Morgan asked. Because I thought you'd say this. This isn't the time to speak out. It's the time to fix things. Morgan chuckled softly. Send that exact quote to them. Down in the airport lobby, the old crew members, those who had just been suspended, stood silently along the hallway. Nicole, who once tore up Morgan's ticket, now pale-faced, stood alongside Brian and Captain Daniel. No one dared look at Morgan as she walked by. Linda paused softly. Do you want me to say anything to them? Morgan shook her head. No. Silence is the clearest lesson right now. A boy sitting with his mother near the window whispered, Mom, is that the lady who got kicked out but didn't get angry? The mother replied, It's more than that. Honey. She even helped people like us get seats on the next flight, on the airport information board, next to Flight 2187's name. The words appeared, Delayed internal review in progress. Morgan knew this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of a long chain of actions audits. Firings, new appointments, and rewriting every line in the ethics handbook she had signed countless times when she was appointed. But today, at least she did what many CEOs avoid, faced the issue. Showed up and took responsibility. No apology letters, no spokespeople. Just her own voice right there in the cabin. Among the people, under the open sky, Morgan walked out of the airport, not through the VIP exit. She walked with the other passengers, through the same security checkpoint, and finally stood in line waiting for a taxi. Beside her, Mia quietly asked, Aren't you tired? Morgan replied, Yes, but this is a proud kind of tired, because not everyone gets to be tired after standing up for what's right. The story didn't end with a grand finale. No final applause, no movie soundtrack, just the soft yellow airport lights and the sound of taxi engines rolling. But in the heart of everyone on that flight, they knew they had just witnessed something rare. A woman had her ticket torn but didn't back down. An intern refused to stay silent. An airline refused to hide the truth. A system finally woke up. Thank you for following the story to the very end. If you believe justice doesn't have to shout to be heard, please leave a comment, share the video, and subscribe to the channel so we can spread more stories like this.